This is Marvin Rappaport, and I'm interviewing today Joan Farrow of Monticello, New York, for our oral history project for the Ethelbert B. Crawford Public Library. This is a project that's associated with StoryCorps, in which we're trying to record the history, the memories, and the reminders of what was the Catskill culture, sometimes known as the Borscht Belt. And we're pleased to have today, and by the way, with me today is Alan Barrish, who's the former director of the library and who's been a history buff in his own right, and he will be assisting with the recording and perhaps asking a question or two. Joan, if you could start us off by telling us a little bit about your history and your family's history, in particular how they came to Sullivan County and ultimately their involvement in the resort industry.
I think it's a very interesting story, and it's two-sided. There are two families involved. My father's family and my mother's family, who didn't know each other in Europe, in Belarus, which is where they came from, but came here at different times and eventually got together. That is, my mother and father got together.
Right.
My father's family started off in Belarus. My grandfather had 3 sons who were almost eligible for the Russian army, and he didn't want them in the Russian army, so he decided to leave the country and come to the United States. But he had further assistance by his wife, whose sister, his aunt, was a rabble-rouser, and she was beginning to get the Tsar a little bit nervous, and they were looking for her. So my grandmother convinced her husband to take her sister with him to America, and he did. They got here, and he went to work in New York, and didn't have enough money yet to bring the whole family over, but he did go back after a few years and visited with them, and at that time, my father was conceived. And then he left, went back to America, and 3 years later, he was able to have enough money to bring them all over. So he went back and got them all, and that was probably in 1904. My father was 4 years old when he got here, and they weren't happy in New York City. They were country people. So this aunt, who had been the subject of his leaving to begin with, had married and had bought a little farm in Woodridge. And when she heard that they were unhappy in New York, she said, "Why don't you come up here?" So they all went up to Woodridge, and they all worked the farm, and they lived on the farm. And my father went to school in Woodridge. However, they didn't have a high school. So he had to go by school bus from Woodridge to Monticello to go to school. It was the only high school around. So that's where he met my mother. My mother's family came from Belarus also, but under different circumstances. My grandmother was the only girl. There were 6 brothers, and she had 6 brothers, and they lived on a shtetl. And one of the farmers had a son who had an illegal still. And one day the Russian officers came along, and the Polish people who were working for that particular man didn't like him, so they burned down the fields, and he had all of the bottles of liquor hidden in the fields. So they arrested the boy, put him in jail, and his father went to all the other shtetl people and asked them to put up their farms also for bail, which they did. As soon as he got out of jail, he left the country, and they all lost their farms, and as my grandmother told me, even our feather beds. And she was 16 at the time. She, with a cousin who was also 16, a boy, walked across Europe till they got to Holland, where they knew a couple of people who put them to work, and they earned enough money to get on a boat and come to America. When they got off the boat, the man who had left them all in the lurch was there to help them all in this country to get jobs and places to live. And who was he? And I don't know if I should give you this name. He was Ralph Lauren's grandfather.
Interesting.
And so they worked in New York for a while, but they also were not city people. And my grandmother had taken her children to a public library and asked the library to help her teach them how to speak English and read and write English, and she helped. But at that point, they felt they had to leave the city, and my grandfather had tuberculosis. And of course, they sent everybody with TB up to the mountains. So they came up to the mountains too, and they bought a little farm in Kaimisha Lake, and from that little farm became a little hotel, and then it grew and grew and grew until it was the Kaimisha Lodge and Country Club. Now, there are people who will argue with me about this, but I remember it vividly because I was a little kid, and I went there to see the hotel. But my grandfather was too ill to carry on the running of the hotel. My grandmother was the cook. My mother was born in the kitchen there. Dr. Brakey delivered her. Brakey was a well-known doctor in the area. And so they sold the hotel. And my Uncle Dave, who was the oldest of their children, had been in the Army in World War I with George Rockwell. George Rockwell, you know that name, I'm sure, was a drunk. And he got on top of a pile of coal, and he sunk in, and he couldn't get out, and my uncle saved his life. So because of that, when the Rockwell Hotel burned, which was on the corner of St. John Street and Broadway, and it burned and they wanted to sell it, my grandfather put in a bid, and they favored him because they owed him. And so they bought that property, and they built a taxpayer on that corner with stores down below and apartments up above. And they lived there for...
Roughly what year would that have been?
It would have been 1931, 32.
And this is the Rhulen family, the Rhulen side.
This is the Margolin family.
Ah, okay.
This is the Margolin family, my mother's side of the family.
Because today we associate the Rhulen family with that corner.
Well, I'll tell you how it got that way.
For many years. Okay, great.
Anyway, they built that building, and they moved there. And my mother and dad was still living in New York City, where my mother was going to law school. My mother was one of the two women who graduated from law school in the first graduation at St. John's Law. My father had been going to law school, but he found a very lucrative business to get into, so he left law school.
That business was?
Yeah. That business was placing engineers. And, of course, in 1929, when the market fell and everything fell apart, his business fell apart also. And by that time, I was born there. My mother had graduated, and they moved back up here to the family, who lived on St. John Street, had a little apartment there, and Walter was born also in New York.
I was going to ask, yeah.
Peter was born here.
Mm-hmm.
And my father then went to my mother's mother, Mrs. Margolin, and borrowed $500 and bought into an insurance agency over the Rialto Theater in Monticello. And that was the beginning of the Rhulen Agency. He then grew it, and it got bigger and bigger, and we were catering in the Rhulen Agency at that time to the hotels and the bungalow colonies and the rooming houses, whatever, in the resort industry. And eventually they grew it so big that they couldn't stay there any longer. And by that time, my grandmother had acquired the building next door, which had belonged to, I believe it was the Wassers. And so they built that building. They bought it originally because they wanted to put my Uncle Dave in business there, and it didn't work out. Anyway, they built it around so that it came from Broadway to St. John. And if you remember, the Oriental Restaurant was in that St. John portion, and our apartment was above it. So we all moved in there, and Walter and I started school here after a couple of years.
Where was your first school?
Here, on St. John Street.
The small building.
The small building.
It's attached now to the high school.
Yeah. Well, then it went up through 6th grade, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, everybody prospered. The agency got bigger and bigger, till finally my father talked to my grandmother and bought the building that was Broadway and St. John Street to put the Rhulen Agency in it. And that's where it was, upstairs, over the A&P and a few other stores that existed at the time. But it grew, and as we all got older, I was the first one. I came home from college one day, and my father said, "I need you in the office," because the cars were coming off the assembly line after the Second World War, and he needed help. So I went to work then, and I stayed there, and eventually got married to Jesse Finkelstein. He was at the time. His stepfather had adopted him and his brother, and gave him his name. Jesse's name was Arrow. That's how we got Farrow. We put the F in front of Arrow.
Excellent.
And we kept that name for a while. And Jesse worked for his family for a while, but they didn't get along. And they were asking him to do too much, and he just couldn't do it, physically. And so my father came in one day and said, "Listen, Jess." And my grandfather at the laundry had told him that he would like him to come and work there, my grandfather and my uncles, but he was going to do it. But my father said, "No, you're not. You're coming to work for me." So that's how he got into the insurance business. Now, I have to tell you that the Rhulen agency was a niche marketer, and we all had different niches. And each one of my brothers and my husband started their own business within the business. Originally, the business was catering to the resort industry, but that was only one niche. The other niches were, Jesse's niche was American camping. Walter's was running the business. Peter's was animals, horse racing, and so forth. And it grew. Those niches grew and grew and grew all over the country. We had one of the largest insurance agencies in the United States at the time. But eventually, as we got older, we branched out into other forms. When our children came into the business, which they did, Jonathan was running the exercise schools and all kinds of anything related to exercising and camping. And Jason was doing the same. And eventually Walter's children came in. So it was just, our children were the oldest.
Right.
So when his children got older, they came into the business also.
There were other members. You mentioned the laundry.
Yeah.
There were other members of the Rhulen family, although not all known by the name Rhulen,
well, I'll tell you,
who were in different businesses
as
around
they came,
in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah. What happened was my uncle Sam, which was Rhoda Andrews' father, was the oldest. Then Izzy, which is Charlotte Keston's father, and Richard Rubin's father, he was the second. And the third was my Uncle Jack, whose family doesn't live here any longer. Mm-hmm. And really, I don't think they exist too much. I think there's only one of them left. And they all...
Were they all Rhulen?
Jack was Ralbin.
Rolbin.
My father became Rhulen because when he went to law school, there were 5 Max Rubins in his class. So he had to change his name so they knew who he was.
So it was originally Rubin.
He was originally Rubin. Jack was originally Rubin too, but he changed right away to Ralbin. The others kept their name. As a matter of fact, Richard Rubin is my cousin, Dr. Richard Rubin, who was worked here in the podiatry area. Mm-hmm. And he's still here. He's in Emerald Green now. And the rest of them more or less scattered all over the country.
Mm-hmm. And what was the community like as you were growing up in the 40s and probably into the 50s after the war? How did what we know as the Catskills transform into this very, very popular resort area?
Well, it became popular, I think, because Jewish people couldn't find places to go otherwise. Whenever we drove to New York, we would see the signs, "No Jews allowed," or "No Hebrews allowed," or whatever it might be on all of the motels and everything going down. So where else were they going to go? So the people who were here, who had the religion already, decided to make them comfortable. The Grossingers and the people from the Concord and, all of the other people. As a matter of fact, my aunt, my mother's sister, Miriam, married a man by the name of Mo Herlands. The Herlands had a hotel also in Kymisha. So Kymisha was lined with hotels. And they all catered to all of these people who used to run here during the summer, to get away from the heat in New York City, because at that time I don't think they had much air conditioning, and there were very few planes taking people anyplace. That's what I think destroyed the Catskills, with planes, the airports, and the availability of ways to go elsewhere. But as a kid growing up here, we had small classes. I think we all got a great education. I remember when I applied to college, there was a quota system, and I wanted to go to medical school. And of course, almost all the medical schools had filled their quota of Jewish students. And so I finally got into Western Reserve University in Ohio, and I was scared. I was saying, how can I compete with all these kids who come from these fabulous schools all over the country as compared to little Monticello, New York? Well, guess what? They had trouble keeping up with me. And it was just a delightful experience to know that I came from a school that was superior to a lot of the schools in the country. And my children have found the same experience up until now.
When did you graduate?
46. And I found that I had the ability to compete with top students from all over. And my husband found the same thing. He went to Albany State, and he also found the same experience, and he graduated in my class.
How big was your class?
The class normally would have been about 75, but that was the year that all the GIs were coming home from the Second World War, and a lot of them hadn't graduated from high school yet, so they came to school, and we coached them. As a matter of fact, Carl Arfa was one of them, and I was his teacher. And he graduated when we did, because he didn't have enough to graduate before. And so we had a graduating class, I think, of 100 and some odd, 103, 104, which included all those GIs. And it was a different life, because during the war, we had our own gardens. We used to call them victory gardens. We had to take care of our walk, because there were no cars. My father had a car. If you were in business, you had a certain leeway. You could have an A, B, or C, or whatever ticket to buy gas and so forth. And he had a car, so he was able to drive.
What percentage of your class was Jewish?
I'd have to guess 40%. And I would say around that number. And they were from all over. We had farmers from White Lake, and it was for the high school. The Zieglers, who were from White Lake, and from all over.
This is prior to it being a consolidated school district, where there were still schools in Kiamisha and Wurtsboro and
Not
White
really,
Lake.
not really,
Is that
because in grade school, they had closed a lot of the little one-room schoolhouses. So the kids from Kiamisha were coming in by bus, from Sackett Lake were coming in by bus, and so the class was a fairly good size. But those one-room schoolhouses disappeared.
Tell us about what happened after the war. You mentioned some of the GIs came home to Monticello.
Yeah.
What about the transformation, if you will, or maybe the growth of the resort industry after the men came back from the war,
Oh,
and
it
then
grew
families
it
could
grew
come
even
up?
bigger
Yes.
at that point.
And so were there larger, for example, we think of Concord and Grossingers as the larger resorts, but many other hotels came into being in the late 40s and early 50s,
or
blossomed.
even before that.
Right, but blossomed during the 40s.
Well,
and
and it
50s.
became a haven for people who were going to college to work their way through college in the summertime.
Right.
So that Gibbers, in particular, was a growing hotel, and I became aware of that when I went shopping in North Carolina to one of these furniture places when I was furnishing my home. And the man who waited on me asked where I was from, and I told him, and he said, "Do you know Abe Gibber?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, I know Abe." And I know his daughter was a close friend of mine. And he said, "Well, I worked there in the hotel, and I lived in Abe's house." And I said, "Well, you're lucky." He said, "Yeah, and I've got to tell my brother." Well, he called his brother, who was the head of one of the big accounting firms in New York City, called him out of a meeting, and he said, because he wanted him to hear what I had to tell him about the Gibbers. And he got on the telephone and he said, "What is it you got to tell us about the Gibbers?" I said, "Your Your brother wants to know about them, and I have to tell him everything I know. But I mean, this is wherever I went in the world, I found people who remembered, people who lived here or worked here, or they had fond memories of the Catskills and of the Borscht Belt.
We learned also that many marriages were made, sort of born here.
I
People
imagine
met
they
one
were.
another at the various hotels and resorts.
Yeah, well, my mother and father met on the school bus between Woodridge and Monticello. She was in Kymesha. But a lot of them did. I've heard that too. But people were very happy. The entertainer. Oh, the Laurels. The Laurels had probably one of the highest levels of entertainment in the area, next to Grossinger's and the Concord. And I remember going there as a kid. My father used to go and take me and my mother to hear certain performers who were just sensational. Of course, we didn't have television in those days, and radio wasn't absolutely wonderful. And here they were performing on the stage. Some of them were working as waiters and performing on the stage. It was a really wonderful experience to know all these people and to see them work.
Well, we know that a number of the comedians and other entertainers, Buddy Hackett, Sid Caesar,
Yeah.
Danny Kaye, all got their start in the Catskills at
Many
various
of them,
hotels.
yeah. But I remember also the fellow who was working at Kutcher's, who was a basketball player. I'm trying to think of his name, and
Will
I can't.
Chamberlain.
Will Chamberlain. I remember seeing him towering above everybody,
Yes.
taking care of the luggage, taking
was
it
a
out of
bellhop.
cars. Bellhop.
Yes.
Where did you live growing up here?
On Park Avenue in Monticello.
Okay.
After we moved out of the apartment on St. John Street, we bought that house. It was during the Depression, really. My father bought that house from the bank for $5,500. And a builder had built it for his daughter, but he couldn't keep up with it. And we lived there. I was married in that house. And then the reception was at the Concord afterwards. But it was, and when I look at it now, I get a little upset.
Where is it? What?
It's the yellow brick house at the top of the hill going into Park Avenue.
Okay.
And in fact, what's her name lives there now? Dr. X. Can't think of his name. Anyway, that's where we lived, and we would walk to school. As a matter of fact, my brother Walter insisted upon me walking with him because there was a bully on the block who used to like to beat him up, but he wouldn't touch him if I was with him. So I had to walk to school that way every day. But it was a good experience.
What would you say was the epitome, the highlight of the Catskills? In other words, when was it really its greatest heyday? Would you say the 60s, the late 50s? I mean, things started to deteriorate a bit in the late 60s, certainly in the 70s.
I would say that probably around the 50s it was in its heyday, and because everything was busy. I don't know if the racetrack might have had something to do with it too.
1958.
Yeah,
which changed.
yeah, changed.
Brought
it a
in
little
a
bit.
lot of people
Yeah.
from other communities.
We all thought the racetrack was going to be such a wonderful thing when it opened. Of course, the wonder of it was all the people who went bankrupt from overbetting. A lot of prominent people, yeah. But no, the Catskills were beautiful, and they were unique. And to this day, some of the best performers on Broadway and in the movies grew up here, or made their mark here. So it was a thrill to be able to get to know all of these people.
What about personal highlights, things that you remember the most about growing up here that others may not know, that have special meaning to you?
That's a tough question. I didn't get a chance to think it out, but I would probably say I was very popular in high school, and I had a great social life. And I was active in a lot of organizations. And as I grew older, and when I got married, I became a den mother for the Cub Scouts, and I was a Girl Scout. All of these things were very rewarding here because there were opportunities to do things that you wouldn't have in the city.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a good experience for me.
Joan, we also know, we couldn't have to mention that you were prominent in the hospital in particular. That was one of the things that you cared
Well-
very much about and helped grow
Well,
and improve.
a lot of the reason for that was the family had been in the. My grandfather, I have a picture of him with a spade breaking ground at the Monticello Hospital
Up on the hill.
up on the hill. Both grandmothers were beginnings of the Ladies' Linen Society, which built the brick building that was right opposite it, and they were in it for years. My father was president of the Monticello Hospital for 16 years. My brother Walter was involved in it, and then I became involved in it. I'm still involved in it. I've been the president of the foundation now for, I think, 23 years. But not only that, when the college came in, that changed things too, and I got involved in that as well. But in our business, we were totally involved in the Borscht Belt with the hotels. I remember Jesse used to go collecting from the hotels and the bungalow colonies, and I used to ride along with him. And Peter, too, I remember him telling the story at Jesse's funeral about how they went to a particular bungalow colony to get paid, and Jesse told Peter to go around to the back door and wait in case this guy tried to run away. But it was an interesting experience growing up here.
But maybe we should embellish it slightly, because while we've chatted with others in our history program, there was a culture, if you will, of people having bills, running up debts during the season or the early part, and then paying those bills later in the year.
Yeah.
And all the merchants, and most of the merchants in the village were mom and pop shops,
Oh, yes.
ended up extending credit to a number of the people in the resorts, knowing that they would have to wait for the season, if you will, to come in for those bills to be paid.
Everything was based on the season.
What was the season? For those who don't know, what did it run from? When to when?
I would say that it ran from Memorial Day to right after the Jewish holidays in
Past Labor
September.
Day through the Jewish holidays
Yeah.
in September. And all of the hotels and all of the bungalow colonies, well, less bungalow colonies because they were just during the summer months, but all of the hotels opened for Passover, and unless it was a very late
It depended
holiday,
upon
stayed open
when it
through
fell.
Rosh Hashanah, the
it depended
Jewish
upon,
New Year.
Yeah, it depended upon when the holidays fell.
And what was the difference in the nature of this rather sleepy little upstate community between the winter months and the summer months? Could you explain to people who may not have experienced it?
I don't think there was much of a change, except there was a lot of traffic in the summertime. But the stores were still open, the movies were still open, the schools were in session. There was no cessation of any social life or anything else here, because the local people really kept to themselves a great deal. They didn't patronize the hotels. They didn't stay in the
Unless
hotels.
they worked there.
Unless they worked there. Or unless they went in for a special reason or a special performance or whatever it might be. So life went on as it should all year long. Of course, everything was crowded during the summertime, so you had to wait online to get into a restaurant or to get into a store sometimes.
What about the Jewish atmosphere around here? There wasn't many Orthodox in those days, right?
There were a lot of Orthodox, not Hasidic, Orthodox.
Yeah.
Everybody, I know my brothers were bar mitzvahed, and everybody that I knew of, all the boys were bar mitzvahed, and those were constantly going on. The synagogue seemed to prosper. There were two. My family by both sides of my family each belonged to a different one, and then finally they were combined into the one.
All of the hotels, though, were kosher.
Yes.
Right? I mean, virtually all of the Sullivan County prominent hotels catered to Jewish families from New York and elsewhere and kept kosher kitchens. Is that correct?
Yes.
So there were numbers of kosher butchers and other suppliers of foods and produce and what have you to the various hotels. And the vast majority of the clientele were Jewish folks from the metropolitan area.
Yes, definitely. That's where they came from. And it was a long ride. Of course, there was a train at one time.
To where? To Hurleyville, I understand.
Well, it stopped in Monticello also.
Also in Monticello. So how would, in the 40s and even into the early 50s, how long would it take to get here if you drove up from New York?
Well, there were no trains then. If you drove up, I would say 3 hours, 3.5 hours, depending upon the traffic. If you came up on a weekend when all the men were coming up, because the women were here already, then it could be 4 or 5 hours.
Yes,
Because-
there was pre-Thruway and pre-Route
yeah.
17, the new
Yeah.
Quickway, as we call it.
Yeah.
So you'd be stopping or driving through all the little villages and hamlets along
Yeah.
the way with a single
And
red
it-
light could back you up for an hour,
It could still happen, you know.
I suppose.
And
Which
it
was
does.
what laundry did you own? Your family own?
The American Steam Laundry
That was the one on.
was
St.
on. They were both on St. John Street. The Monticello Laundry was up closer, and the American Steam Laundry was right next to the high school.
Okay.
And my grandparents all lived on St. John Street. The Rubens lived in a house in front of the laundry, and the Margolins lived in their building on the corner of St. John. When Jesse and I were married, we had an apartment over the Oriental restaurant also, and that's where the Lifshitz, Ralph Lauren's cousin lived, Seymour Lifshitz.
We know that the Oriental was the scene of a famous fire in the 50s. Was your apartment also taken out by the fire? Or family?
But we weren't in the apartment then. Marion and Vic Gordon were in the apartment.
Who
and
got out
They
safely?
got
up
out
there?
safely, but they
Yes.
lost almost everything.
Wow.
But that fire started in the Oriental restaurant, but we had already moved out. We were building our house on Colonial Hill, and we.
Did the laundries deal with the hotels mostly?
Oh,
That-
yes.
That's how they did.
Oh,
Because there was
yes.
a few huge ones around, weren't there? I know.
There were 2 laundries here and 1 in Woodridge,
Oh,
and those 3 hotels did the whole area.
yeah. Okay.
I don't think there was a laundry in Liberty or any of the other places.
And eventually it moved to what, North Street, the laundry?
Didn't Judge Ladina's family
Yes.
have something to do with it?
Ladina was related to the Rubens. Mrs. Ladina and my Aunt Rose, who was married to Isidore Reuben, were twin sisters.
Oh, so you're. Oh,
Yeah.
I know you're related. Oh, okay.
So, that's what happens here. You got to be careful who you talk to.
And Wasser said some kind. Was it linen? What was Wasser? Wasser
Linen. Yeah,
Yes.
said- Okay.
Linen. He had a store here on Broadway.
Yeah.
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 Yes. Again, most of the businesses, except for the mom and pop shops in the village, any of the ones that had any success or got larger were because they catered to the hotels, whether it's linens or liquor or produce.
And most of
or-
them were Jewish.
or candy
by the
business.
way.
Yes.
The Cohns owned the Monticello Laundry. The
Yes.
Rubens owned the American Steam Laundry. And in Woodridge, I forget who owned that. It was also a Jewish family. And they catered to the whole area.
Another question about the insurance and the hotels. So the insurance business start to have hard times when the hotels folded, or they were totally out of that world by then.
Almost totally out of it. By
Okay.
that time, we were nationwide,
Uh-huh.
and we had expanded our borders and our programs, and very few hotels were left.
Yeah. Okay.
But I think we had Grossingers, and we had the Concord, and we had Kutchers, and a couple of others, and that's all that was left. The rest of them were gone.
One of the other questions we've been asking our interviewees is the impact of the Borscht Belt on American culture, not just this little area of New York State. What would you say the impact of this resort area was on American culture generally, not just in New York?
I would say it's entertainment, it's music. The people who got their start here and became very famous, and who created a lot of the things that we do in the world today. That's probably the impact of it. Plus, the culture of the service in the hotels was excellent. They all had their dining rooms, which were fabulous. And of course, a lot of the other hotels around the country learned from them.
Maybe we should explain. All of the hotels were run on a 7-day, 3 meals a day basis. So when you checked in for a week or 2, you got all your meals at the hotel. You didn't
Oh,
have to
yes.
go elsewhere for anything. And you as well got entertainment virtually every night. So many of the hotel owners said, we'll take your keys when you come in with your car. And when you're ready to leave, we'll give you back your keys.
Well, there was no other place to go anyway. Where else were you going to go and eat, and where else were you going to go for entertainment?
Well, there were restaurants in the community that one
Not
could
to
go
speak
to.
of. The restaurants were nothing. They were coffee shops. And but the hotels were known for their food, and they were known for their service, and they were known for the entertainment. People came here for that.
Year after year.
Year after year. Plus, they also had expanded their services. They had wonderful swimming pools, and they had all sorts of things, ponds to row on, and ice skating rinks, and things like that.
At some point, and we're going to wind down shortly, they became winterized, as we call it, and there were indoor pools, and there were all year-round activities.
Right.
But only a small number of the hotels actually were able to do that?
The larger hotels did that. And I remember that Kutcher's had the ice skating rink. That's where my daughter learned how to ice skate. And I think they were the only ones who had an ice skating rink.
Concord did as well.
Did the Concord eventually?
Yeah.
Yeah. But the hotels were a wonderful place to be, and people loved it. They loved being in that culture. And, of course, they met a lot of people that they knew or that they became friendly with, and they became friends for a long, long time. And they'd come up at the same time just to be together. It was a very congenial atmosphere. So it flourished until I think the airplane really is what killed it.
Well, it was said that the low airfares to Europe and the cabanas in the city and air conditioning were the three factors that changed the resort nature.
Yeah.
And also, some of the younger members of the family didn't want to go to hotels that their parents or grandparents went to.
They expanded their views. They started skiing. Jewish kids didn't ski before. Skiers went all over the country. You know, things of that nature. They learned, they became Americans, let's put it that way, and became more into America than into the religion. Right. That's my opinion. And because I think that's the way I feel, so.
Any last minute observations as we wind down?
I would just tell you this. Ralph Loren's family's name was Lipschitz, and they had, his uncle had a wholesale grocery business here on Broadway, near where Dr. Cohn's house was. And they had a little bungalow colony on Hillside Avenue in the summertime. That was his family, his mother and father. And he was a very generous guy, and he treated his family beautifully. And we had an apartment in New York, the Rhulen agency did, and we used to, because we were in New York doing business all the time. And one day I see Mrs. Lipschitz, that's Ralph's mother, in the building, and I said, "What are you doing here?" And she said, "Well, mine Ralphie got us an apartment here. He doesn't want us living in Brooklyn." So I said, "Well, I come down every once in a while. Is there anything I can do for you?" She said, "If you can bring me some nice fresh eggs, I would like it." So every time I went to New York, I brought eggs for her. And she had on a gorgeous mink coat one day and a gorgeous mink hat. And I said, "You look lovely." She said, "You like this?" I said, "Yes, it's very nice." She said, "Mine Ralphie made it for me." It was such a, and he was bar mitzvahed here, I think in the Landfield Avenue Synagogue.
It's a great story.
Yeah.
Well, just a reminder that we're talking today with Joan Farrow of Monticello, New York, who's a member of the Margolin and Rhulen families, and who shared with us her stories of growing up in the Catskills, the nature of the resort area, and we thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. It's great.
It's my pleasure. I'm delighted to do it.